For years when I would go to wow, bright lights. I'll tell you anything you want to know. For years when I would come to events like this, I used to use this line, I'm happier than Helen Thomas at a Hamas rally to be here. But the thing is, she went on to get her 72 virgins, and it's sort of getting a little dated, and I haven't been able to figure out what to replace it with. For a while during the election, I used happier than Elizabeth Warren in a sweat lodge. But the thing is, as a fake Indian myself, I find that kind of humor offensive. And, happier than Joe Biden on Lime Jello Day at the home. I don't know, that just doesn't quite work either. So anyway, I'm open to suggestions. The worst thing about watching that video was I've lost 50 pounds since I was on with Piers Morgan, and now I'm glad I did. More about Piers in a bit. One thing that James left out of that generous introduction, and people who've seen me speak before know I really do actually bring this up pretty much every time I do public speaking, because I'm just so proud of it. When the LA Times picked me up as a columnist, Barbra Streisand canceled her subscription in protest. And so I asked my wife what I should talk about tonight, and she's a professional speechwriter. And she said, "Oh, it's easy. Just take a page from Barack Obama and talk about yourself." But I figured maybe I shouldn't do that. I do want to say, I'm really truly impressed with the KPI. Dave Traubert has done some amazing things here, along with his team. And I really like state-based think tanks, and they've gotten so impressive in the last 10 years because I think a lot of the message for the message that they carry and the mission that they have, it's finally dawned on people that the real fight is in our backyards. And the fight for liberty begins in our backyards, and it begins closest to home. And so some of the most important work that's done in the United States these days is done by places like KPI, and I congratulate you for it. It used to be that sort of think tanks, including the American Enterprise Institute, we were sort of like, conservative think tanks were sort of like the Christian monasteries in medieval Europe during the Dark Ages. They kept the flame of civilization alive until the ignorant masses were ready to receive the word. And in the last few years, they've more become sort of like Shaolin temples, where they send fighting monks into battle to do the good work. And I think it's a change for the better. That said, things are still tough out there for people who actually love liberty and free markets and time-honored conservative principles. It kind of reminds me of one of my favorite old jokes about. And I'm sorry about the jokes thing. I know this is one of these problems I have. I'm supposed to be insightful and funny, which is a really tall order. It's sort of like the guy who wants to be both a veterinarian and a taxidermist at the same time. Because that way you can promise you'll get your dog back no matter what, So forgive me if I go back and forth between one and the other, but there's an old story about an anatomy professor at a medical school who walks into one of those giant auditoriums where the kids are stacked up all the way to the back. And he walks right in, and he asks a question about the previous night's reading assignment. And he says, "What organ of the human body expands to 8 times its original size when properly stimulated?" And he goes, "Miss Smith," and points to a nice little girl up in the back row, and she gets all flustered and starts to blush and is really uncomfortable. I couldn't possibly answer that question. I'm sorry. And the professor goes, "Okay, Mr. Jones," and he points to the young guy in the front row. And Mr. Jones says, "The pupil of the human eye when it goes from light to dark." And the professor says, "That is correct. Now, Miss Smith, I have 3 things to tell you. First of all, you didn't do your homework. Second of all, you have a filthy mind. And third of all, you are destined to live a life of unfulfilled expectations." So we'll get to the moral of that story in a little bit. As mentioned, I'm here to talk basically about the argument in my book, The Tyranny, Cliches, which I'm going to stipulate up front was an absolutely terrible title for a book. much to my dismay, something like 20% of American radio talk show hosts don't in fact know how to pronounce cliche. And it is mortifying when you're on a radio show and they say, next up we have Jonah Goldberg, author of the brand new great book, I loved it, The Tyranny of Cliches. You don't want to correct them and embarrass, but anyway, the problem with the title is it doesn't really tell you what the book is about. The subtitle does, but the title, it sort of sounds like an amped up style guide, and that's not what the book is about. The core argument of my book is basically that American liberalism masquerades as an ideology-free worldview. Liberals claim that they just want to do what's right, and they just follow the facts, and they're just empiricists and pragmatists and fact-finders, and they have all of the data on their sides. As Paul Krugman likes to say, facts just simply have a liberal bias. No, seriously, he's written that. You can Google it. And I'm not going to get deep into the sort of eggheady weeds and all this, although I'm glad to do it if you like. My argument says that I argue that this goes all the way back to the progressive era and the introduction of American pragmatism, the philosophy of American pragmatism, founded by basically William James and John Dewey. John Dewey, who was basically the father of the American public school system, by the way. And their basic argument was that all competing ideologies were bad. Theirs was the only good ideology. And they had this brilliant insight that they borrowed a little bit from Nietzsche, which was we can destroy all our competitors if we deny we have an ideology, and we claim that everyone else are ideologues. And so they would always say, we have facts and science and reason on our side, and anybody who disagrees with us, well, you're just blinded by what Karl Marx would call false consciousness. You're just blinded by ideology. And this idea has gone on, has been basically the core epistemological and philosophical worldview of American liberalism. This, William James said that he wanted to just judge ideas by their cash value. He just cared about what works. And Barack Obama loves to talk about what works. He always loves to say, and he said it in dozens of interviews, that he's not an ideologue, he has no reigning agenda or ideological agenda, he just cares about what works. He just wants to go with the facts. He's a pragmatist, a problem solver. In the speech he gave on the day before his inauguration in 2008, he gave a speech in Philadelphia where he said, what this country needs is a new Declaration of Independence. We need a new Declaration of Independence from bigotry, prejudice, small-mindedness, and ideology. So when he talks about people being ideologues, he's never talking about himself. He keeps the ideologues down in sort of the Star Wars cantina with the bigots and the idiots. That's what he thinks of ideology. He doesn't think he has an ideology. Ideology is for his opponents. And that's why whenever you hear him in debates about the budget and all this kind of stuff, it's always his opponents who only want to follow their ideological agenda rather than do what's right for the country. And what's right for the country is always agreeing with his agenda. And this is the defining style of argumentation that liberals use. So it was interesting, that clip that they had of me with Piers Morgan, and I feel bad about being such a pain in the butt to Piers Morgan, but I've concluded it's the fastest route to his brain. So I was on that show, and Fox let me out of my kennel to go do book tour stuff, and I was allowed on other networks very briefly. So I go in there, and look, I want to be very honest. I don't expect any interviewer to read a whole book just for one 5-10 minute interview on a daily show. They can't do it. I mean, I have friends who have shows. The idea that you can read all of these books and do a daily show is just impossible. So I forgive him that. I was a little surprised when I walked into the studio and he was, and I'm not making this up, he was looking at my book the way an orangutan would look at an iPad. Just sort of like, and he was looking at me, looking at the picture, looking at me, looking at the picture and all that, and he was a very strange guy. And so he asked what I consider to be the greatest question an interviewer can ask an author. He said, what's your book about? Love that question. And so I basically said what I told you guys. It was something to the effect of, and you can find it on YouTube, something to the effect of, if I had to boil the book down to one thing, it's that the biggest lie that liberals tell is the lie they tell themselves when they say they don't have an ideology, that they don't have an ideological agenda. And I went on about that for a minute. And he says, right, good. And then we got right into an argument about some commercial about Mitt Romney. and wanted me to defend it or attack it or whatever. I can't really remember. It's like most of his shows. It's pretty forgettable. But what was funny was that this was the first clue of something I saw throughout the book tour, was interviewers who thought they could rebut the argument of my book by confirming its thesis. And what Piers Morgan would do is he would say, look, Jonah, I'm a straight shooter. I call them like I see them. I'm just interested in the facts. You're the conservative. You're the ideologue. And it was exactly the point I was trying to make. He actually thinks that he's a straight shooter and that he had no ideological agenda, even as he was carrying water for Obama like Gunga Din. And so I found this all over the place. I went on the San Francisco NPR station, because I'm there all the time. And I'm making this case about how conservatives aren't, that conservatives are ideological, but we're honest about it. You talk to a conservative, and the conservatives say, I'm a conservative, or I'm a libertarian. We're honest about what our ideological principles are. But liberals hide it. They don't talk about their ideology. They pretend they don't have one. And caller after caller would call in and say, why do you conservatives have to talk about ideology so much? Why do you care so much about it? It's just not the way liberals think. We're not we don't care about ideology. We just want to do what works. We just care about, what the good thing to do is. And it was about the fourth caller who called in. You could basically hear his ponytail over the phone. And he said, I don't understand you conservatives. You're constantly talking about ideology and first principles and all this kind of stuff. Why do you want to impose your values on everybody else? Why are you always going around trying to impose your views on the American people? That's not what liberals want to do. And so this sort of raises one of the first points that I'd like to point out to people, particularly on college campuses. There is this idea that conservatives are the aggressors in the culture war. I mean, you find it suffuses almost all of the media coverage of almost every cultural debate, whether it's abortion or gay marriage and all these things. It's always the conservatives who want to impose their views on other people. Now, take gay marriage, and I'm actually more sympathetic to gay marriage than you might think. I think marriage has bigger problems than gay marriage, but at the same time, you're talking about an institution that, depending on how you do the math, was defined one way for 4,000 years. And it's only been in the last decade that all of a sudden it's going to be defined another way. And that idea has been imposed and driven by progressives and liberals on the entire country. And yet, it's conservatives who are holding to this millennia-old other definition who are somehow the aggressors in the culture war. It is bizarre. And you look what happened to this guy at Mozilla, right, who disagreed and he lost his job over it simply because there is no safe harbor now from what the progressive agenda is. You can't disagree. Now the left is basically going around. They've won a lot of these culture war issues, and now they're just executing the dead, or executing the wounded on the battlefield. And so, but you find this with everything. You find it with abortion. Again, I'm pro-life for sort of idiosyncratic reasons, but I'm pro-life, but whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, if you're pro-life, whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, it's an ideological position either way, right? If it just depends on how you value the issue, how you score it. If you're pro-life, it's because you put the sanctity of of human life above a woman's choice, or because you believe that we all have inalienable rights. I mean, there are lots of different arguments for why you're pro-life. And there are lots of different arguments for why you're pro-choice. It could be you put the sovereignty of individual humanity, you think no one else has the right to make this decision, blah, blah, blah. We've all heard these arguments. But whenever you read the press coverage of this, whenever you hear debates about this, it is always, the ideologues are always the pro-lifers. The ideologues who are dogmatic and hidebound and want to impose their views on other people are always the conservatives, and the people who are just for choice and freedom and personal liberty are always the pro-choicers. And that sort of framing of things, where it's always the conservatives who are the aggressors, is ridiculous. But it's everywhere that you look. And so I first got the idea to write this book. Well, I first got the idea about this argument a long time ago. There was a piece in the New Republic by a guy named Jonathan Chait, longtime writer for the New Republic, who's now at New York Magazine. And he wrote a piece called Fact Finders. And his argument was that, exactly as I said, that liberals aren't ideological, they're not dogmatic, they're open-minded, they're fact-finders. They only care about what works. And he says, as a thought experiment, he says, imagine if God came down to earth tomorrow and told liberals they were wrong about everything in terms of economics. That Milton Friedman was right, Friedrich Hayek was right, Tom Sowell was right, John Maynard Keynes and Karl Marx were all wet, and the free market is the way to go. Chait argued that, well, liberals would immediately become free market, advocates because they just go where the truth is. But if God came and showed conservatives that Keynes and Marx or, the Fabian socialists or whoever, that they were right and that Milton Friedman and Hayek were all wet, conservatives would still hold on to their ideological views because conservatives just won't let go of these arguments from principle regardless of what the facts show. Chait's a really smart guy, but this seems to me too stupid. It's the kind of thing you would expect from like Joe Biden or someone not smart enough to be a taste tester at a lead paint factory. But his sort of lodestone example of this, right? And this was years before Obamacare, or let alone Obama was on the national scene. His best example of this was he said, these conservatives keep going around talking about how we have the best healthcare system in the world. Don't they know that the World Health Organization came out with a study? Don't they know that the World Health Organization says that the American healthcare system ranks 37th in the world? Behind Belize, because I know when you guys all get cancer, you're hopping a plane to Belize tomorrow. But look, there was a study. It was like in a binder. It had charts and everything. It has to be true, right? And so here's the thing about that study. It was the worst study ever. And I'm sometimes accused of hyperbole, so I'm going to read you a quote. It's like the only quote I'm going to read from the prepared text. Forgive me for it, but I think it's important. It's a guy named Scott Atlas, who is actually on the committee that decides who gets the Nobel Prize in medicine. One of the most revered or respected public health experts, used to be at the Stanford Medical Center, chairman of epidemiology and imaging and all that kind of stuff. And he did a careful, close examination of this World Health Organization study, and he called it, and here's the quote, the worst study ever. Why was it the worst study ever? Well, there were a lot of reasons why it was the worst study ever. But one of the main reasons why it was the worst study ever is that the chief, or arguably the most important metric, according to the experts who put this thing together, wasn't on healthcare outcomes. It was on financial fairness. It was on how these healthcare systems are paid for and how egalitarian they are in redistributing wealth to people. Now, here's the thing. I think how a system is paid for and all that is a perfectly reasonable metric for grading healthcare systems. But absent knowing this, or absent knowing the fact that literally a third of the judges and people who decided what the best healthcare system in the world were actually taken by a poll of World Health Organization bureaucrats, no champions of the free market, obviously. But if you just tell a normal person, such and such country has the best healthcare system in the world, they might reasonably assume you're talking about the healthcare system, about the health results that they get from the healthcare system. If we talked about the best, when we talk about the best education in the country, the best college education in the country, no one thinks you're talking about a community college where the tuition is the most egalitarian. They think you're talking about Princeton or Caltech or MIT or something like that. But they hide these sort of ideological assumptions within the study so that they don't actually have to admit what their ideological assumptions are. And that's sort of the argument that I'm making. George Orwell in 1946, and what I would argue was the greatest essay on politics in the English language, conveniently called Politics in the English Language, he talked about this, where he said, he didn't use the word cliches because he's smarter than I am, and even then knew that radio show hosts couldn't pronounce it. But he said that these euphemisms, these dead metaphors, these turns of phrase, they come to us like prefabricated hen houses, and they tend to do our thinking for us. And what he was getting at was how some of these things, they seem like what Alexis de Tocqueville called a clear but false idea. You immediately get what someone was talking about, And it's a way to win arguments without actually making an argument, like little Trojan horses that get into your brain. And I'm not, just for the record, I'm not talking about bumper stickers and buzz phrases and all that. That is endemic to politics, and everybody has them. Conservatives, liberals, Democrats, Republicans. That is what politics is about, is reducing things down to simply digestible ideas, right? So I like the phrase the death tax. I hate the phrase job creators. Republicans use this all of the time. I agree with the policies behind job creator, but, look, people don't go into business to create jobs. People go into business to create wealth, to accomplish something, and if they create jobs in the process, that's great, and they're proud of it, and they love giving people work and all the rest. But if you don't believe me, and I think there are people know a lot more about business in this room than I do, just go into a bank and tell a loan officer, I have got this fantastic idea for a job. I need $10 million. And the loan officer will say, great, what is it? And you say, well, I haven't worked out that yet, but I'm going to create a lot of jobs. Right? It's just not how we do economics. One that I cannot stand from liberals is this metric of created or saved jobs. Right? The stimulus created or saved 3 million jobs. This is utterly unfalsifiable. Right? It's like, this microphone right now is scaring away the unicorns. Prove me wrong. Right? Every morning, and I swear to you this is true, every single morning I wake up and I do or save 500 push-ups. I think my pacemaker upset the microphone. That was weird. Sorry, that kind of threw me off. So anyway, there's nothing wrong with having an ideology. All an ideology is a checklist of your principles, the things that you value, right? That you bring to bear on new information and new facts. Does it, for me, some of my ideological principles are: does it expand individual liberty? Does it limit government? Does it expand freedom? Does it respect inalienable rights? These are things I care about. And if there's some proposal that comes along the way, I will ideologically apply my checklist to see how it conforms. It doesn't mean I'm immune to facts. It doesn't mean I don't care about the facts. But that's how I think about things. And liberals, think about things in ideological ways too. Does it promote income inequality? Does it support, discriminated groups? Blah blah blah. You can go down the list. But the difference is that conservatives are honest about it. In fact, all of this talk about how conservatives and libertarians are dogmatic misses the fundamental fact that, in fact, conservatives and libertarians are far less dogmatic. Dogma comes from the Greek. It means seems good, that which you take for granted. We're all dogmatically convinced that gravity is real because we just experience it in our lives and we don't even question it. The essence of liberal dogma is that government should do good where it can, when it can, whenever it can. And that liberals are the only ones who get to decide what is good. This was the essence of my first book, Liberal Fascism, right? The whole basic argument, boiled down to, that the left thinks it has a monopoly on political virtue. The further you get away from the left, the closer you get to bad things, right? So whether it's racism or fascism or all the rest. I've been saying for years, the best working definition of a fascist in American life is simply a conservative who's winning an argument. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of these sorts of things. One of the classics is violence never solved anything. Right? You hear this all the time. The problem with this is that it's just absolutely untrue. Violence is really useful in certain situations, particularly violent situations. Say you're a cop and you see a liquor store being robbed or a lady being attacked, right? And you grab your gun to put a stop to it. And then wait, go, oh, damn it, this thing's useless. And you throw it away because violence can't solve anything, right? But it's not just the logic chopping that is the problem with this. Violence never solved anything, right? I mean, violence ended slavery, violence, ended the Holocaust, violence did lots of things. There's an idea of moral equivalence. There's an ideological idea at the heart of violence never solved anything. We get this idea a little bit from Thoreau, but mostly from Gandhi. Now, Gandhi was an interesting cat, lots of interesting things and good things to say about the guy, but he also had some very strange views. And he loved to talk about how violence doesn't solve anything. But he was pretty selective about how he used it. People don't remember that his advice to the British, when the Germans were getting ready to go to war against the British, his advice was, surrender your homes, surrender your island, but keep your dignity. His advice to the Jews of Germany was that they should commit mass suicide. Last name being Goldberg, you might guess that I don't find this the most efficacious public policy proposal. It's telling, though, that he never said violence never solved anything to Hitler. He only said that violence never solved anything. He only preached nonviolence to the British. The reason he preached it to the British is that the British are, whatever the mistakes of the British Empire, and there were many, at the end of the day, the British are an inherently decent, conscientious people with properly formed consciences, and they are open to moral suasion. He never said it to the Nazis because it wouldn't work on the Nazis and he didn't care. And Orwell is wonderful in this. You should really, if you get a chance, read Orwell on Gandhi. You can find it anywhere on the web. Well, not anywhere on the web. If you just poke around aimlessly for it, you'll never find it. But if you search like Orwell and Gandhi, you'll find it really easily. And Orwell points out, look, if there is a Gandhi in the Soviet Union or in Nazi Germany, we don't know who he is because he was carted off in the middle of the night and murdered along with the rest of his family. And this gets at this sort of fundamental moral equivalence that runs through so much of the left. You know, whatever you think about the Iraq War or Afghanistan or Vietnam War and all that kind of stuff, the people who preach violence never solved anything, they never said it to our opponents or to our enemies. They only said it to us. It was always an argument to keep us from doing something. It was never, you never heard anyone yelling at Saddam Hussein when he was throwing dissidents into wood chippers, you know, hey man, violence doesn't solve anything. It was only us when we tried to get him to stop that they started preaching this stuff. And William F. Buckley had a great line about this, about the moral equivalence inherent in this philosophy. My old boss used to say, look, if you have one guy who pushes old ladies into oncoming buses and another guy who pushes old ladies out of the way of oncoming buses, it simply will not do to categorize them both as the sorts of men who push old ladies around. So, I'll give you another. Right, so, and this one's sort of near and dear to me because I was at Williams College last week, and Michael Bloomberg, history's greatest monster, is going to be their commencement speaker, and it is wildly controversial up there. To the left, which I just find hilarious. And they're going around basically saying that Michael Bloomberg, because of the stop and frisk policies in New York, which were launched by Giuliani, and which I can tell you as a kid who grew up in New York and was mugged often, have done more than anything else to make that city livable again. But anyway, wherever you want to come down on that. And so they're going crazy. Now the thing is, I've been beating up on Michael Bloomberg for years from the right, and so it's just kind of fun to watch him do it from the left. But so Michael Bloomberg, because he's a nebbishy 5'0" Jewish guy from Manhattan, thinks that the only way he can be president of the United States is if he can get all the people like you to give up your ideological principles. And so he launched an organization called No Labels. And the argument behind No Labels is, why can't we all just drop these labels? Why do we have to talk about conservative versus liberal, libertarian? Why do we care about these things? Let's just do what works. And you find this all over the place. You know, liberals love to say, you know, don't label me, man, right? I've never met a conservative who says, don't label me. You know, we actually own our labels. But so this whole idea of no labels is a way to sort of convince the country to drop all of its ideological objections to anything that he's doing. And this is a common trope that you get from politicians all the time, hopefully none in this room, where you hear politicians, Hillary Clinton does this all the time, Al Gore does this all the time, well, they'll say, why do we have to have these ideological fights? Why do we have to have these partisan squabbles? Why can't we just do the hard work the American people sent us here to Washington to do? Now, the problem with this is that, you know, I've been following politics for a really long time. I think I've been reading the New Republic since I was 12 because I'm that cool. I have never, ever heard a politician of any party say, we need to drop these philosophical debates and these partisan fights and these ideological squabbles. And so, for the spirit of unity and bipartisanship, I'm going to abandon all of my principles and agree with you. People only say this stuff when they want you to shut up and get with their program. And so, this no labels thing, but beyond all that, there's a real philosophical problem with this idea of no labels, right? Because labels are another word, and you can look this up. Labels are another word for these things called words. And words are like really important, and not just because I make my living from them. Words are what define civilization. They communicate concepts like good and evil, moral and immoral, hot and cold, poison and non-toxic, right? And if you don't believe me, if you think labels don't matter and just get in the way, I challenge you, go home tonight and remove all the labels from your canned goods and cleaning supplies. And then just let nature take its course. I'm sorry I'm drinking so much water. I smoked an enormous amount of pot before I got here. And I get dry mouth. And then there's this whole, as we were hearing earlier this evening, there's a whole panoply of things about the children, right? From George Bush's Leave No Child Behind. Really, I can't leave any of them behind. One of my favorite ones is from Joe Biden, right? Where he said, during the gun control debate stuff, he would say, if it saves just one child's life, it's worth it. If these laws save just one life, it's worth it. Well, first of all, what's really annoying about this is that anyone who disagrees with that is automatically put in the pro-dead kid position, right? But second of all, that's not how we do public policy. If a law were justified by saving a single human life, we'd all have to drive at 5 miles an hour. We'd have to wear bike helmets 24 hours a day and walk around in those giant inflatable sumo suits, right? Look, I hate using this example, but it really illustrates it, so I want to be very clear. This terrifies me, it horrifies me, it repulses me, but it is a fact established by federal government statistics that a half dozen or a dozen kids, little kids, every year drown in plastic buckets in their backyards. Because they fill up with water, they stick their head in, they get stuck, and they drown. It is, as a father of a little girl, I find it terrifying. At the same time, I would not, therefore, argue that we should mandate that all buckets have holes drilled into the bottom of them so that they can't hold water anymore, right? But this is the way they argue, is to automatically put you on the defensive for holding your principled positions. Another one that you were talking about tonight was taxes, which I gather is a big issue around here. This is one of the ones that sort of drives me crazy. Obama likes to say that taxes are just neighborly. It's what good neighbors do. He also talks about how he justifies a lot of his agenda. He talked about what the central idea of his entire philosophical approach to government was, and he said, if I had to sum it up with one thing, it would be this idea that we are all our brother's keeper, all our sister's keeper. Now, there's a certain amount of biblical illiteracy going on here, because and I say this as someone who only considers sort of half of the Bible biblical, but you'll let that go. There's the phrase, our brother's keeper, or my brother's keeper, appears exactly once in the Bible. And it's when one brother is trying to dodge the murder rap for the other brother. I spent a lot of time when I was looking up this phrase trying to figure it out. And there are other places in the Bible that sort of mean what Obama thinks this phrase means. But the word keeper means exactly what it sounds like. It's like a zookeeper. It's someone in charge of somebody else. And when you have the President of the United States talking about how the government has to use tax policies to ensure that we are all each other's keepers, it kind of creeps me out a bit. The other argument they love to use is that, and this is a line that they got from this guy George Lakoff, it says taxes are just the dues we pay to be members of civilization. Right? Now, the number of problems with this, it's kind of like a piñata. You can hit it from any angle and you'll get some reward. But first of all, dues are voluntary, right? I mean, if you go to a country club and you refuse to pay your dues, you're not going to be a member of the country club anymore. If you don't pay your taxes, men with guns come to your house and send you to jail. That's sort of a bit of a category error. They also, at every country club, I'm not a country club guy, but I'm open to correction on this. I don't think that they actually charge people at gyms and country clubs different dues based upon your annual income. But this is one of these things that you find throughout the tax debate, or debates about taxes. We're hearing earlier about, for the common good, right? It is always some abstraction who's getting taxed. It's not you, it's corporations, or the wealthy, or the 1%. It's never an activity. It's never we're not going to tax wealth. We're just going to tax the wealthy, as if this is an incredibly fine and important distinction. The one that I think is sort of most important, and I'm on a big kick these days about trying to actually persuade people, which I'm going to get to in a minute, and something I bring up every time I'm on a college campus, is there is this deep-seated belief among young people, and they get this idea in part because they're taught this from a very early age, that liberalism is somehow rebellious. Right? This idea that being a liberal means you are sort of going against the grain. You're easy rider, And so I love to go on college campuses when I have a room full of liberals, and I love to sort of say to them, so let me get this straight. Your professors are liberal. The administrators here are liberal. Hollywood is liberal. The media is liberal. The publishing industry is liberal. The fashion industry is liberal. The music industry is liberal. And you think you're sticking it to the man by being liberal. And you can sometimes tell they're thinking because they give me this look the way my old basset hound would give me when I tried to feed it a grape. It was sort of... But sort of getting back to this common good thing, there is this idea, the core cliches of liberalism all revolve around some version of community and unity. These ideas that we're all in it together, that we all work together. Barack Obama likes to say, government is just another word for those things that we do together. The Democratic National Committee began, I should back up. For reasons having to do with original sin, I attended the 2012 Democratic Convention, and the opening video of the convention began with the words, and I swear this is a direct quote, government is the one thing we all belong to. Now, as a sort of Tea Party-ish kind of guy, that makes me want to flip the safety on my rifle. Because it is a total and complete inversion of what this country was founded on. The whole idea of this country was that we are citizens, not subjects. The government belongs to us, we don't belong to the government. We, the people, are sovereign. I'm going to get back to that in a second, but then there was the Life of Julia. I assume most of you guys remember what that was. For those who don't know, the Obama campaign put out this thing called The Life of Julia. It was a PowerPoint presentation about a fictional girl named Julia. Every single frame begins with the words, under President Obama. Right? So under President Obama, Julia gets a Pell Grant, Julia gets a small business loan, each one a different frame throughout the course of her life. I would argue that the single creepiest sentence in modern American politics was, under President Obama, Julia decides to have a child. That just sort of makes me feel unsafe. I don't want to date any of or age any of the women here, but I'd be interested to know how many of you ever said, under Jimmy Carter, I decided to have a child. And then at the end of it, so the whole thing, it's 70 years into the future. At the end of Julia's life, she gets to work in a garden, a community garden. She doesn't even get her own garden, right? But, and it's still under President Obama. But the interesting thing about this, and this is something that I think is important for conservative and libertarian audiences to hear, is that you're not the target audience for the Life of Julia. I'm not the target audience for the opening promotional video of the Democratic Convention. Other people are. And that message works. And there's a reason why it works. And there's a really serious point. Civil society is breaking down in lots of ways. The family is breaking down in lots of ways. Out of wedlock births today for whites are higher than they were for blacks when Pat Moynihan warned about the breakdown of the Negro family 40 years ago. Hispanics are doing worse. This has huge consequences for society and for communities. My colleague Charles Murray at the American Enterprise Institute likes to point out that no bachelor ever volunteers to coach Little League soccer. And the reason for this is well established in the social science literature. Men do what their wives tell them to do. And so you could be the greatest single mom in the world, and there's some incredibly impressive single moms out there. But at the end of the day, there's just not enough time in the day to do all the things that a two-parent family can do. There was an op-ed, there was a column in the Washington Post a little over a year ago that I found particularly poignant. It was about why African Americans are at their lowest participation rate in Major League Baseball since 1975. And it's going down. And there were lots of different reasons for it, and I'm not claiming that this is the only one. There are a lot of different reasons for why blacks aren't playing baseball as much. But the author of the piece talked to a bunch of black Little League coaches in inner city Washington, and he asked them what they thought. And one coach said, well, if I had to pinpoint one thing, I would say it's that baseball is a game taught by fathers. You think about it. Basketball and football are games you learn from peers. You play down at the playground. You just go out in the street and play. Baseball, you've got to learn by, first of all, playing catch with your dad, and second of all, sitting on the couch as he explains the utterly Byzantine world of numbers that is baseball. And if someone doesn't do that to you, you just never get all that into the game. Well, it's not just baseball. It's lots of things. And lots of things that a civilization needs to be communicated from one generation to another aren't being communicated. And if you've read Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, this is not an argument about the black community. This is an argument about American communities all over the place. There are other things going on. The changing in the manufacturing sector means that having a strong back and a good work ethic doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to get into the middle class anymore. Immigration has very specific effects on sort of civil society, and it's not because of racism. Robert Putnam, a Harvard sociologist, did this enormous study on this over years. He delayed publishing his study for a year because he hated the findings. And the findings were that immigration erodes social trust. That it just turns out that if you have an ethnically homogeneous community, people understand how to talk to each other across their neighbor's fence. They understand how to work things out in civil society. But when people come from all sorts of different places and they don't have a common language, they don't have common institutions and common assumptions about things, they tend to hunker down and withdraw. Eventually, the hope is, and the history shows, that this can be worked out in the long term. But in the short term, these things happen. The reason why I bring all these things up is one of my favorite books in the entire world is a book called Quest for Community by a guy named Robert Nisbet, in which he argues that we are all hardwired to want to belong to a community. We want to feel like we're part of something larger than ourselves. We also are all hardwired to want to belong to a family. If you grow up not really feeling like you got the kind of love and satisfaction from a family that you thought that other kids were entitled to, or if you grew up in a community where there was no sense of community, you don't stop desiring these things. You don't stop yearning for these things. If you're starving to death and you go into a restaurant and you say, I'll have the surf and turf, and they say, well, we don't have anything like that, you don't go, well, then I won't have anything. You'll have crackers. You'll have whatever they offer because you want to have that feeling of belonging. And we have a lot of people in this country who desire that. So they hear government is the one thing you can belong to, that you can feel part of. If you look at the life of Julia, she's got no parents, no husband. She has a kid. The kid turns 18. He's out the door, never comes back, doesn't even bring her fertilizer for the community garden. The government under President Obama in the life of Julia is playing the role that families and churches and synagogues and communities traditionally played. And they understand that that is a great marketing idea for the Democratic Party precisely because that's what so many people are yearning. People out there at dinner tonight A lovely lady was asking me, about why are conservatives losing to liberals? Well, one of the reasons why it seems like we're losing, and I'm not sure that we are, but one of the reasons why it often seems like is that liberals just take politics a hell of a lot more seriously than conservatives do. And I mean that there's a gross generalization, there are lots of exceptions, but as a general rule, Republicans are more normal people. And what I mean by that is not they're all freaks and weirdos and they look like they belong in the Star Wars cantina or anything like that. What I'm saying is that you look at the trajectory of most Republican politicians. They're successful people in their own communities. They get married young, they build a life, maybe they join the army, they have a family, they're big in their church and their community and their civic organizations. They get a little successful and then they want to give something back. Now, just for the record, I hate that expression, give something back. When the inventor of the cronut made tens of millions of dollars for figuring out that if you could magically wed the donut and the croissant, it would create human happiness, he made millions of dollars on this, and then he decided to get involved in philanthropy to give something back. He gave us the cronut. He's not under any obligation to give anymore, but it's nice that he's doing it anyway. But my point is that that's the typical path of a Republican politician, is that they go through from traditional red state communities, they make a success of themselves, and then they want to expand the scope of their public service, and they go to Washington. When Ron Johnson asked Hillary Clinton the question that got her to say, what difference does it make about Benghazi, it was sort of telling. 40 years ago, Ron Johnson was a struggling young man trying to launch a plastics factory. 40 years ago, Hillary Clinton was an activist lawyer who was putting into practice her dissertation on Saul Alinsky. Just very different orientations towards politics. Now, the good news is that I don't think we're really losing. Because I don't think any of these fights are ultimately won or lost. Not forever. And this is one of the most crucial things about persuasion, which conservatives have been losing sight of, in my opinion. Libertarians too. We are great about talking about Hayek and Burke and all of these kinds of things, but we've sort of lost sight of the ability to tell stories and persuade people. What has two thumbs and loves Ronald Reagan? This guy. But I get a little tired when people talk about Ronald Reagan being so great because he was so principled. Yeah, he was principled. Absolutely. He was put on this earth to do two things, chew gum and kick ass, and he ran out of gum in about 1976. But he was also a master politician who knew how to persuade people. You listen to his old speeches, he's constantly telling stories. Stories is how human minds understand things. From the Bible on, everything about our civilization that we really understand, first and foremost, comes from stories. And Republican politicians have gotten bad at telling stories. They've gotten great at talking to audiences that already agree with them. And this is one of the problems for a lot of pundits my age and younger, is you can have a pretty good career only talking to audiences that already agree with you. But that's not what politics are about. Politics has to be about persuasion. It has to be about bringing more people to your side than are already on it, or you'll lose at politics, particularly in a democracy. And if it's not about persuasion, we might as well just make it a Civil War reenactment club or a Klingon wedding where we just all play our part and then go home. We have to be about winning people over to our cause. And a simple, tough fact is that at the national level, Barack Obama has done more to persuade people about the problems of liberalism than conservatives have. Right? We didn't know, as critics of Obamacare, right? We didn't know that they were going to farm out this website to the finest computer programmers the Amish community has to offer. True story, just as an aside. I basically made that joke once on the Special Report online show where things get a little wackier. It's every Wednesday night. It's just web only kind of thing. And so I made this joke about the Amish computer programmers, and Charles Krauthammer decided to sort of beat me up about it. And he gets all haughty and says, straight into the camera, I, for one, want to disassociate myself from Jonah Goldberg's mean-spirited and bigoted attacks on the fine and upstanding people of the Amish community. And I cut him off, and I was like, Charles, why are you even bothering? It's not like they're watching. So, I know I'm running long, but I swear I'm wrapping up soon. So, Edmund Burke, the founder of modern conservatism, says, example is the school of mankind, and he will learn it no other. And what he meant by that was, sometimes you have to show people. You can't just tell them. And what Barack Obama did is he showed a whole new generation that progressivism, by its nature, overpromises and underdelivers. And when people don't remember, but in 2008, we were hearing constantly, and a lot of people, even on our side, were worried that this was going to be a new progressive era. This was going to be a new Deal. The only serious debate between Time and Newsweek was whether Obama was more like Lincoln or FDR. And that simply hasn't transpired, in part because progressivism, by its nature, overpromises and underdelivers. It makes what I call the fundamental category error in politics. I have this long spiel. I usually do it for quite a while, but I'll cut it down to just simply this. I think almost all political arguments can be boiled down to John Locke versus Jacques Rousseau. This idea that basically the Lockean idea, the Lockean revolution, says that we are all individuals. Our rights come from God, not from government. The individual is sovereign. We are captains of ourselves, as he puts it. We form government as a necessary evil to do some limited, specific tasks, but we keep our rights to ourselves because the people are sovereign. The Rousseauian vision is the complete opposite. The group is more important than the individual. Rights mean nothing outside of the collective. The general will rules all. Locke says that we are born in sin, built from the crooked timber of humanity, and that the perfect life comes in the hereafter, not the here and now. Rousseau says we're born noble savages and we're made corrupt and evil by society. These two visions tell you a lot about left and right, but they also tell you a lot about the human heart, because we're all a little Lockean and we're all a little Rousseauian. We all want to be recognized as individuals with unique contributions in their lives, and we all want to belong to a group. We all want to feel part of a cause larger than ourselves. And whenever you hear that cliche, grab your wallet. Because invariably when you hear it from a politician, when they say we have to dedicate ourselves to a cause larger than ourselves, when you hear it from John McCain or whether you hear it from Barack Obama, what they're saying is you have to increase your loyalty to some bloated, inefficient government program. Right? Some new paid volunteer program. I always thought a paid volunteer was just a job. But we in our own lives have causes larger than ourselves all over the place. Your families, my family, my daughter. What parent here wouldn't take a bullet for their kids? Your churches, your synagogues, your businesses, your communities. These are all causes larger than ourselves, but they're not defined by government. And so the fundamental category error in politics isn't that one side is all for the individual and one side is all for the group. That's not it. It's that the fundamental category error in politics is this idea that it's this mistake that libertarians never make, conservatives only rarely make, and progressives considered a core of their entire philosophy. And it's simply this. Government cannot love you. Government cannot be your mother, it cannot be your father, it cannot be your tribe, it cannot be your church, it cannot be your bowling league. It cannot fill the hole in your soul, it cannot give you meaning. My boss in the American Enterprise Institute is a big champion of this thing called earned success. It turns out that the only thing that is proven to make people lastingly happy is a sense of earned success. Accomplishments that you have done yourself. Raising healthy kids. Building a business. Running a soup kitchen. It doesn't have to be about making money, but it has to be something that you did yourself. And at the end of the day, government cannot earn your success for you. It cannot give you happiness. It cannot give you love. It can only do the things that it's good at, and it's not good at very much. And I'll close with this, I swear. Capitalism is the greatest cooperative system ever created by man to alleviate poverty and get people to work peacefully with one another. It is the greatest communal effort ever known to mankind. It has just one flaw. It doesn't feel like it. It is so good. It's like that old Ivory soap ad, 99 and 44, 100% pure, that you don't notice it. The greatest essay in the history of libertarianism by a guy named Leonard Reed called I, Pencil. It's written from the perspective of the pencil. And I'm an Eberhard Faber #2 pencil. And what the pencil goes on to point out is that nobody knows how to make a pencil. Nobody knows how to make a pencil. Pencil manufacturers do not know how to make pencils. Pencil manufacturers know how to put together the last 5% of the ingredients. The pencil points out in this essay, my wood comes from Indonesia, my rubber comes from Canada, or maybe vice versa. The tin comes from Argentina, my paint comes from Delaware. People speaking different languages in different cultures with different religions who don't even know each other, working cooperatively to produce something that ends up costing less than a pencil. Capitalism is that good at it. There's a guy at the British Museum a few years ago who came out with an exhibit to celebrate iPencil called iToaster. He made a toaster from scratch. And I mean scratch. He galvanized the rubber, and I don't know how you make a toaster, but he did it from scratch, right? He mined the iron ore. It took him 8 years. It was a really crappy toaster. And so I started with a story about a guy going into a classroom and living a life of unfulfilled expectations. I'm going to end with a story in a classroom. I go to a lot of these sorts of events. I speak at a lot of, sort of country clubs with guys with red pants and plaid jackets. I don't know why, but for some reason, those are the guys who always stand up and ask me, how are we going to fix this and how are we going to solve that? And the short answer I give is we're not. Not forever, because there are no permanently solved problems in this life. There are no permanently solved political issues, because there are always going to be more of them who think the government can love you, who think that what they're going to get from government is what they never got from their communities or their families, that the government is going to be the thing that they can belong to. All of the progressive totalitarian ideologies of the 20th century were all based on this reactionary idea that they could recreate the tribe from the state on down. Fascism was tribalism for one nation. Nazism was tribalism for one race. Communism was tribalism for one class. The only thing that has broken out of this is this Lockean revolution. And the problem is that human nature is constantly trying to drag us out of the path of the Lockean revolution back into some sort of tribalism, because capitalism doesn't feel communal. And if you don't have these institutions in civil society, in your communities, to provide the sort of meaning and significance in people's lives that capitalism can't provide, they will start looking to government to get it. And so the story I'm going to tell is about a guy is a physicist, and he's talking about the heliocentric nature of the solar system and the galaxy and all these kinds of things. And at the end of the talk, a little old man says, "Professor." And the professor calls on him, and the little old man says, "Very interesting talk, but I'm afraid you got it completely wrong. You see," and the professor sort of laughs and says, "What do you mean?" And the little old man says, "You see, the Earth, it sits on the back of a giant turtle." And the class sort of laughs, and the professor sort of giggles, and he says, okay. And he decides to humor him, and he says, "All right, well, what's that turtle standing on?" And the old man goes, "Another turtle." And now the professor, and he goes, "All right, and what's that?" And the old man cuts him off and says, "It's turtles all the way down." This fight between the Lockean and the Rousseauian parts of the human heart is turtles all the way down, forever. And that's okay. Because, as T.S. Eliot says, there's no such thing as a truly lost cause, because there's no such thing as a truly won cause, as long as people keep up the fight. And I want to thank the people at the Kansas Policy Institute for keeping up the fight. Because at the end of the day, we can't lose as long as our side is committed to winning, at least for this generation. Hannah Arendt used to say that every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. They're called children. And that means every generation you're going to have these arguments over and over again. And that's okay, because we're on the good side. We are on the side of maximizing human happiness. We are on the side of maximizing human prosperity. We are on the side of fighting poverty. We are on the side of fighting ignorance. And if we're outnumbered every now and then, that's fine. We can be those happy few, like in Henry V, because this is a good fight, and if you can't fight it every day yourself, because you have other things going on in your lives where the important stuff is done, and family and business and all the rest, that's fine. Give a little help to places like the Kansas Policy Institute who are fighting that way 365 days a year. Thank you all very much.